Hello, my name is Pete Sylvester. I'm with Thomas Edison State University. This is the Nuclear Capstone Team Bravo. Our topic is the impacts to the nuclear power industry on the defunding of the Yucca Mountain repository. So my discussion today is going to focus on three areas. Area number one was the reason of the research for Yucca Mountain. Number two will be an overview of several of the obstacles that have impacted Yucca Mountain. And number three is a general overview of the research that's been completed at Yucca Mountain. So one of the key concerns for the nuclear power industry has been the long-term storage and disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. Now in 1982, Congress enacted the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. This act was to provide for the development of long-term repositories for the storage of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act provided guidelines for the recommendation and nomination of potential locations by the Secretary of Energy to the President of the United States for further site characterization and research. Now, 3 sites were initially nominated, but in 1987, Congress amended the Nuclear Waste Policy Act to allow continued site characterization and research at only one location, Yucca Mountain. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about the research in a few minutes. Right now, we'll discuss some of the obstacles. The site characterization and selection of Yucca Mountain had several opponents, both in Nevada and in the federal government. For example, in 2002, the Department of Energy recommended approval of Yucca Mountain as the nation's first long-term geological repository. President Bush endorsed the approval, but as allowed by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the governor of Nevada vetoed the approval of Yucca Mountain. Now, this led to heated debate in Congress at both the House and the Senate. Ultimately, both the House and the Senate overruled the governor's veto by majority vote, and in July of 2002, Yucca Mountain was approved for continued development. Now, one of the most vocal opponents of Yucca Mountain in the Senate was Senator Harry Reid, Democrat from Nevada. Now, he voted against the approval of Yucca Mountain, and in 2006 he became the Senate Majority Leader. Now, he used his position and influence to do 2 things. 1, work with other legislators to impede the progress of Yucca Mountain, and 2, more importantly, used his position on the Senate subcommittee to reduce the budget for Yucca Mountain. Now, despite these obstacles, in 2008, the Department of Energy submitted the Yucca Mountain Repository license application to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for approval. Now, also in 2008, Senator Reid received a powerful ally. Then presidential candidate Barack Obama, during his campaign, promised that he would abandon the Yucca Mountain project. In February of 2010, with the support and direction of the Obama administration, the Department of Energy filed a motion with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to withdraw the license application for Yucca Mountain. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Atomic Safety and Licensing Board disagreed with the legality of the Department of Energy's withdrawal of the license application, but ultimately the review of the license application was halted. Now, coinciding with this, numerous state and private entities also opposed the license withdrawal and filed a lawsuit in the United States Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia Circuit Court. President Obama went on in his 2011 federal budget to include no funding for the continued research and work at the Yucca Mountain Repository. Again, lawsuits were filed against the federal government and the president for the legality of stopping the Yucca Mountain Repository, contrary to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Now, one item that the Obama administration did do was that they established a Blue Ribbon Commission on America's nuclear future in January of 2010. The Blue Ribbon Commission's charter, as defined by their website, was to conduct a comprehensive review of the policies for managing the back end of nuclear fuel, which is the spent nuclear fuel, including all alternatives for the storage, processing, and disposal of civilian and defense-used nuclear fuel, high-level waste, and material derived from nuclear activities, so medical, other locations as well. Now, the Blue Ribbon Commission was divided into several subcommittees. The disposal subcommittee to the Blue Ribbon Commission provided several recommendations in their final report to the full committee. The first of those recommendations was that the U.S. should develop one or more permanent deep geological facilities for the safe disposal of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste. The Blue Ribbon Commission at their start stated that they were not there to determine the legality of the actions of Yucca Mountain. They were not there to determine an appropriate storage location. Their job was to figure out what is the right avenue for the United States and the way going forward. The subcommittee further concluded that geological disposal of a mine or in a mined repository is the most promising and technically accepted option available. The Blue Ribbon or the Disposal Subcommittee further recommended a single-purpose organization needed to develop and implement a focused integrated program for the transportation, storage, and disposal of nuclear waste. On top of the disposal of the nuclear waste, one of the other concerns has been how to transport the nuclear waste from its storage in 39 different states around the country to one central repository. Now, their next recommendation is that the access to the balance of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act's implemented Nuclear Waste Fund and the revenues from annual nuclear waste fees payments must be provided to the new organization. The new approach is needed for site and development of future nuclear waste facilities. These should be adaptive, staged, consent-based, one of the bigger things that they came up with, and governed by partnered arrangements or legally enforced arrangements with all the involved parties. They also said that the roles of the local, state, and tribal as appropriate governments must be included in the federal government's negotiations. So as I said, one of the bigger things that came out of the Blue Ribbon Commission's report was that though deep geological repositories are a necessity, they need to be consent driven. So all parties need to be in agreement for the repository to work. Now, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act directed utility companies to levy fees on electricity generated by nuclear power and pay those fees 1/10 of a cent for every kilowatt produced into a nuclear waste fund. The nuclear waste fund was to be used to develop and operate a national repository. Now, overall, the Blue Ribbon Commission and later the U.S. Court of Federal Claims ruled that the delays of by the Department of Energy in accepting spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste at Yucca Mountain, as required by the Department of Energy's contractual obligations, cost the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars per year in damage payments to the utility companies. And this was annotated by the Nuclear Energy Institute's December 16, 2014 press release. Now, the U.S. Federal Claims Court ruled in 2010 that the Department of Energy owed $57 million in damages to one company due to this breach of contract. Since then, 60 additional lawsuits have been filed, and the Department of Energy has estimated that by 2020, over $21 billion in damages will have been paid, with a $500 million per year fee. So now, back to the research of Yucca Mountain. March 2006 report to the chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works was titled Yucca Mountain, the most studied real estate on the planet. Now, that white paper states that between 1987 and 2003, $3.8 billion was spent on scientific and technical studies at Yucca Mountain. Some of the expenses included the 5-mile tunnel that was drilled into Yucca Mountain, U-shaped, that provides the access port, a 2-mile cross tunnel, and numerous niches and alcoves that were drilled off of the access tunnels. Now, the experiments at Yucca Mountain included tests on the flow of water in and around the site to ensure that groundwater is not contaminated. One of the major concerns, obviously, is ensuring contamination is contained where it's supposed to be in the site casts. Yucca Mountain is actually built above the water basin. Saying that means that any potential flow of water could get down into the water basin and impact surrounding water supplies. So extensive research has been completed into those potential impacts with no or little impact actually being determined. Now the tests have also performed in the impact of the heat in the storage tunnels. One of these items this is based on the potential for the storage cast generating excessive amounts of heat. Sections of the tunnel were actually cordoned off, heater bars were placed in the area, and they recorded the impacts of the heat to the environment, both inside the storage area that was blocked off and into the surrounding areas. There was also extensive seismic and volcanic activity impacts and testing, since the Yucca Mountain repository is located near a fault line. Now, the research was conducted by more than 2,500 scientists from the Department of Energy, 5 national laboratories, the U.S. Geological Society, dozens of universities, and scientists who work directly for Nye County, Nevada. And then prior to the actual recommendation for approval of the license for Yucca Mountain by the Secretary of Energy, the Department of Energy held public meetings. They sent letters to individuals and answered over 17,000 comments to the scientific report summarizing the 15 years of site characterization efforts. Now, in summary, we've discussed the research and site characterization of Yucca Mountain as it was authorized by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. We've talked about the opponents of Yucca Mountain Repository and how they use their political influence to stop the project of stop the progress of the project. And 3, how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Federal Appeals Court ruled that halting of the progress of the Yucca Mountain Repository ultimately was against the law as authorized by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Now, the current status of Yucca Mountain is the license review has been returned by the is in progress by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission estimated about $330 million would be necessary to complete the license application. That is currently ongoing. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission this last year did issue some of their status updates and do expect that within the next year or so they'll complete their review. There are some items that are questions that need to be completed. Those include ownership of water rights, land cross ownership, things like that. If you have any questions for my classmates, please feel free to direct those to me and I'll provide the answers to you. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you learned something from this presentation and have a great day.